The trapper who stumbled into Fort Stockton, Texas in the summer of 1872 looked like he had been carved from the mountains themselves, all hard angles and weathered skin, his buckskin shirt straining against shoulders that suggested he could wrestle a bear and live to tell about it. Eleanor Ortega watched him from the doorway of the general store where she worked, her breath catching despite herself, though she had sworn off men entirely after what her husband had done before he died. The stranger moved with purpose through the dusty street, his dark hair hanging past his shoulders in waves that caught the harsh sunlight, and even from this distance she could see the coiled strength in every movement he made. She turned back to the counter, where Mrs. Henderson was counting out coins for her purchases, but her mind stayed on the stranger. Fort Stockton had become home to her and her son Thomas over the past year, a place to disappear after the shame that had driven them from San Antonio. The town sat in the harsh desert country of western Texas, a way station for those heading further west, and she had found work in a small room where she and 8-year-old Thomas could sleep without fear. "That will be $2.30, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the distraction. Mrs. Henderson sniffed. "Highway robbery is what it is. These prices keep going up." Eleanor did not argue. She had learned that silence served better than confrontation in this hard land. The woman gathered her parcels and left, and Eleanor began reorganizing the shelves, wiping dust from the cans and bottles that lined them. The work was monotonous but honest, and Mr. Pemberton, who owned the store, treated her fairly enough. The door opened again, and she looked up to find the mountain man filling the frame. Up close, he was even more imposing than she had thought. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with arms thick as fence posts and hands that looked capable of crushing stone. But his eyes, dark brown and surprisingly gentle, swept the store before settling on her with what seemed like genuine courtesy. "Afternoon, madam," he said, his voice a low rumble that reminded her of distant thunder. "I need some supplies, salt, flour, coffee if you have it, ammunition for a Henry rifle." She nodded, finding her professional composure. "I can help you with that. How much of each?" 10 pounds of flour, 5 of salt, 2 of coffee, 2 boxes of 44 rimfire cartridges." Eleanor moved through the store, gathering the items. She could feel his presence behind her, solid and warm despite the heat of the day. When she had everything laid out on the counter, she began tallying the cost. "That will be $7.45, she said. He counted out the money from a leather pouch without complaint, his fingers surprisingly deft for their size. "You get many trappers through here?" he asked. "Some. Mostly we see soldiers from the fort and ranchers from the surrounding spreads. The occasional trader heading to El Paso." He nodded, studying her face with an intensity that made her skin warm. "I am Elijah Owens. I have been up in the mountains north of here for the past 2 years. Came down to sell pelts and restock Eleanor Elliott," she replied, then caught herself. That was her maiden name, the one she had reclaimed after her husband died. "I help run this store. Pleased to know you, Mrs. Elliott." "Miss," she corrected, though it was not entirely true. She was a widow, but the title seemed to invite questions she preferred not to answer. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of interest that he quickly banked. "I will be in town a few days. Good to know where I can find supplies." He gathered his purchases and left, and Eleanor realized she had been holding her breath. She exhaled slowly, telling herself that her reaction meant nothing. She had Thomas to think about, and no room in her life for complications. That evening, she walked back to the boarding house where she and Thomas rented a room. Her son was waiting outside, playing in the dirt with a stick, drawing patterns that only he understood. He looked up when he saw her, his serious dark eyes so like his father's, and for a moment her heart clenched with old grief. "Mama," he said, scrambling to his feet. "Can we have stew tonight? If Mrs. Callahan has made enough to share," Eleanor said, ruffling his black hair. Thomas rarely spoke more than necessary, had been that way since his father died. The boy carried his own grief in silence, and she wished she knew how to draw it out of him. They climbed the stairs to their small room, and she washed the dust from her face and hands while Thomas sat on the bed, swinging his legs. The room was spare but clean, with a narrow bed they shared, a small table, and a trunk that held everything they owned. Mrs. Callahan did have stew, and they ate it in the common room with the other boarders, a collection of drifters and working men who barely acknowledged them. Thomas ate mechanically, his eyes distant, and Eleanor wondered again if she had made the right choice bringing him here. But what else could she have done? Her husband's debts had consumed everything, and his violence had marked her in ways that did not always show on the skin. Later, after Thomas had fallen asleep, she stood at the window looking out at the dark street. Somewhere out there, Elijah Owens was bedding down for the night. She tried not to think about him, about the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her, about the strength in his frame that spoke of protection rather than threat. She had been fooled before by a man's appearance. Her husband had been handsome and charming when they courted, and she had learned too late what lay beneath. The next day passed slowly in the store, with only a few customers breaking the monotony. Eleanor found herself glancing at the door more often than she should, and she chided herself for the foolishness. But late in the afternoon, Elijah returned. "I forgot to get beans yesterday," he said, and she thought she detected a note of sheepishness in his voice. "What kind?" she asked, keeping her tone businesslike. "Whatever you recommend." She showed him the dried pintos, and he bought 5 pounds. As she wrapped them, he cleared his throat. "I have been thinking," he said. "I make things sometimes up in the mountains, carve them from wood. Noticed yesterday there was a boy playing outside the boarding house. He looked about the right age to appreciate something like that." Eleanor's hands stilled. "My son Thomas. I thought maybe." "He is yours?" "Yes." Elijah nodded slowly. "I have a drum I carved from cottonwood, stretched rawhide over it. Makes a good sound. I thought if the boy might like it, I could spare it. I can always make another." She looked up at him, searching his face for ulterior motives, and finding only genuine generosity. "Why would you give a stranger such a thing?" "Because I know what it is to be a boy in a hard place, and because making things brings me peace. Giving them away does too." Eleanor's throat tightened. Thomas had so little that was his own, so few things that brought him joy. But accepting gifts from strange men seemed dangerous, a kind of debt she could not afford. "That is very kind," she said slowly. "But I am not sure I can accept. No strings attached, Miss Elliot. Just a gift for a boy who looks like he could use one." She studied him, this mountain of a man offering kindness without demands. Finally she nodded. "He would like that very much. Thank you. I will bring it by tomorrow if that suits you." Tomorrow would be fine. After he left, Eleanor stood at the counter trying to sort through her feelings. Suspicion warred with hope, caution with longing. She barely knew this man, yet something in his manner spoke to her in ways she could not explain. That night, she told Thomas about the drum. His eyes widened, the first real spark of interest she had seen in weeks. "A real drum?" he asked. "That is what the man said. He carved it himself and stretched rawhide over it. Why would he give it to me? Because he is kind, I think, and because he knows how to make them." Thomas fell asleep that night with a small smile on his face, and Eleanor counted that as a victory. The next day dragged interminably, and when Elijah appeared in the late afternoon carrying a round object wrapped in canvas, her heart beat faster. "Miss Elliot," he said with a nod. Mr. Owens, she noticed he had cleaned up, his hair pulled back and his buckskin shirt replaced with a cotton one that still could not hide the breadth of his shoulders. He unwrapped the drum, and Eleanor caught her breath. It was beautiful. The cottonwood carved with intricate patterns of mountains and trees, the rawhide stretched tight and smooth over the top. The craftsmanship spoke of patience and skill. "This is remarkable," she said. "I am glad you think so. Will the boy be by soon?" "I can fetch him from the boarding house if you can wait a few minutes." "I have got time." Eleanor hurried down the street, her skirts kicking up dust. She found Thomas in their room, and his face lit up when she told him the drum had arrived. They walked back together, Thomas's hand tight in hers, and when they entered the store, Elijah knelt down so he was closer to the boy's height. "You must be Thomas," he said. "I am Elijah. I made something for you." He held out the drum, and Thomas took it with reverent hands. The boy's fingers traced the carved patterns, and then he tapped the rawhide surface. The drum gave a deep, resonant sound that filled the store. "It is perfect," Thomas whispered. "I am glad you like it. You play it however feels right to you, no wrong way to make music." Thomas looked up at Eleanor, his eyes shining. "Can I really keep it?" "Yes, sweetheart, it is yours." The boy hugged the drum to his chest, and Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. Elijah stood, and she met his gaze. "Thank you," she said, meaning it more deeply than the words could convey. "You are both welcome. It makes me happy to see it go to someone who will appreciate it." Over the following days, Elijah became a regular presence at the store. He would come by with small questions about supplies, or to purchase items he clearly did not need immediately. Eleanor began to anticipate his visits, to find herself watching the door during the slow hours, and Thomas, who had been so quiet and withdrawn, began to open up. Every night by the fire that the boarding house residents gathered around in the courtyard, Thomas would play his drum. At first, the rhythm was hesitant and uncertain, but as the days passed, he grew more confident. The other boarders would nod along, and sometimes someone would hum a tune to accompany the beat. Elijah came by several evenings, sitting on the periphery and listening with a small smile on his weathered face. One evening, after Thomas had finished playing and gone inside to prepare for bed, Elijah approached Eleanor where she sat on a bench. "May I sit?" he asked. "Of course." He lowered himself beside her, and even sitting he seemed massive, his presence solid and reassuring. The night was cooling from the brutal heat of the day, and stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. "The boy has a natural rhythm," Elijah said. "He loves that drum. He has not spoken this much in months. You gave him something precious. Music has a way of reaching places words cannot." He paused, then added carefully, "His father? Dead a year and a half now." "I am sorry." Eleanor looked down at her hands. "I am not. He was not a kind man." The admission hung between them, and she wondered if she had said too much. But Elijah simply nodded. "Some men are not fit to be husbands or fathers. I am sorry you and the boy had to endure that." His understanding, offered without judgment, loosened something in her chest. "We are managing now. It is better this way." "You are strong," he said. "That much is clear. But strength does not mean you have to carry everything alone." She looked at him then, really looked at him. In the firelight, his face was all plains and shadows, but his eyes held a warmth that made her want to believe in goodness again. "You are heading back to the mountains soon," she said, making it a statement rather than a question. "I was planning to, but I find myself in no particular hurry." Her pulse quickened. "Why is that?" "Because there is something in Fort Stockton that has caught my interest. Someone, I should say, Mr. Owens." "Elijah." "Please, Elijah," she said, testing the name. "I am not looking for complications, neither am I. But sometimes the best things come when we are not looking." She wanted to argue, to push him away before he could get close enough to hurt her. But she was tired of being alone, tired of carrying everything on her own shoulders. And there was something about this man that felt different, felt safe in a way she had not experienced before. "I do not know if I can trust this," she admitted. "Then let me prove myself trustworthy. No rush, no pressure. Just let me spend time with you and Thomas. Let me show you who I am." Eleanor took a breath, feeling as though she stood on the edge of something vast and unknown. "All right," she said quietly. "We can try." His smile was like sunrise, slow and warm. "That is all I ask." The weeks that followed developed a rhythm of their own, as steady and sure as Thomas's drumming. Elijah found work, helping to build a new extension on the general store, and he proved himself as capable with hammer and saw as Eleanor had imagined. She would watch him sometimes when she thought he was not looking, admiring the play of muscles beneath his shirt as he lifted heavy beams, the careful precision with which he measured and cut. He took his meals at the boarding house and gradually became part of the small community there. He was quiet but not aloof, and the other men seemed to respect him. With Thomas, he was endlessly patient, teaching the boy how to carve small figures from scraps of wood, how to identify animal tracks in the dust, how to move quietly through the desert landscape. Thomas began to smile more, to laugh even, and the sound was like water in a drought to Eleanor's heart. She saw her son becoming a child again rather than the serious, frightened creature he had been in his father's shadow, and with her, Elijah was careful and courteous, never pushing for more than she was ready to give. They would talk in the evenings after Thomas went to bed, sitting in the courtyard while the boy's drum lay silent beside the dying fire. He told her about his life in the mountains, about the solitude and the beauty, about watching elk move through meadows at dawn and tracking mountain lions through snow. "Why did you come down?" she asked one night. "It sounds like you loved it up there." "I did love it, I do. But a man can have too much solitude. I did not realize how much I was missing until I came here and met you and Thomas. We are hardly exciting company compared to wilderness adventure. You are wrong about that." He turned to face her, his expression serious. "You are the bravest woman I have ever met. You left a bad situation, made a life for yourself and your son with nothing but your own determination. You work hard every day and you still have gentleness left in you. That is more impressive to me than any mountain I have climbed." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I just did what I had to do. That is what courage is, doing what has to be done even when you are afraid." She looked away, overwhelmed by the intensity of his regard. "Sometimes I am still afraid." Afraid I made the wrong choices. Afraid I am failing Thomas. Afraid that I will never be able to give him the life he deserves. You are giving him love and stability. That is what he needs most." Elijah hesitated, then reached out and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm, and she did not pull away. "Let me help, Eleanor. Let me be part of this." Her breath caught. "We have only known each other a few weeks, I know, and if you need more time, I will give it to you. But I also know what I feel, and I think you feel it too." She did. Despite her fears and her history, despite every reason she had to guard her heart, she felt drawn to this man in ways that terrified and exhilarated her. "I am scared," she whispered. "So am I, but I think you are worth the risk." That night she lay awake long after Thomas's breathing had settled into sleep. She thought about Elijah's words, about the way he looked at her like she was precious, about the gentleness in his massive hands when he helped Thomas carve wood. She thought about the possibility of building something new, something better than what she had known before. In the morning she made her decision. She found Elijah at the construction site behind the store, and he looked up when she approached, setting down his tools. "Eleanor, is everything all right?" "I want to say yes," she said without preamble. "To what you asked last night. I want to try this, to see where it goes." His face transformed, joy washing away the weathered lines. "You mean that? I am still scared. And I need us to take things slowly, for Thomas's sake as well as my own. But yes, I mean it." He crossed to her in 3 long strides and took both her hands in his. "I will be patient. I will be worthy of this trust. I promise you that." "I believe you," she said, and realized it was true. Their courtship unfolded in the public spaces of Fort Stockton, proper and circumspect, but beneath the surface ran currents of deep feeling that grew stronger with each passing day. Elijah would walk her home from the store, and they would talk about everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from philosophy to practical matters. He had an unexpectedly thoughtful mind, and she found herself challenged and engaged in ways she had not anticipated. He brought her small gifts, nothing extravagant but all chosen with care. A piece of turquoise he had found in the mountains, polished smooth and set in a simple silver setting. A book of poetry he had carried for years, the pages worn from reading. Wildflowers gathered from the desert in the early morning when they were still fresh. Thomas approved wholeheartedly of Elijah's presence in their lives. The boy followed him around when he could, soaking up the attention and instruction like parched earth drinking rain. Eleanor watched them together and felt something crack open in her chest, some locked-away place that had been holding grief and fear. One Sunday, Elijah borrowed horses and took them out into the countryside surrounding Fort Stockton. They rode through the harsh beauty of the desert landscape, past stands of prickly pear cactus and mesquite trees, and Elijah pointed out features she would have missed on her own. A nest of roadrunners, the track of a coyote in the sand. The way the light changed as clouds passed overhead. They stopped by a spring he knew, a small oasis of green in the brown land, and spread a blanket in the shade. Thomas immediately began exploring, and Eleanor sat watching him with Elijah beside her. "He is a different child than he was 2 months ago," she said. "He just needed room to breathe, and someone to show him it is safe to be a boy. You have given us both that. I do not know how to thank you. You already have, just by letting me into your lives." She leaned against his shoulder, a gesture that would have been scandalous in town, but felt natural here in the privacy of the desert. He put his arm around her, and they sat in comfortable silence while Thomas chased lizards through the brush. "I am falling in love with you," Elijah said quietly. "I thought you should know." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "I am falling in love with you too. It terrifies me. Love is always terrifying. But the right kind of love is also the safest thing in the world." She turned to look up at him, and the tenderness in his eyes made her throat tight. "How do you know this is the right kind?" "Because when I think about the future, all I see is you and Thomas. Because I would rather spend one day making you happy than a lifetime alone in the mountains. Because when I hold you, everything else falls away and it is just us, and that is enough." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his beard against her palm. "Kiss me," she whispered. He did, gently at first and then with increasing intensity, and Eleanor felt herself melting into him. His arms came around her, strong and sure, and she felt protected in a way she never had before. This was what love should feel like, she thought. Safe and exciting all at once, a partnership of equals, a choosing that came from joy rather than need. When they pulled apart, Thomas was standing a few feet away with his hands on his hips. "Are you going to get married?" he asked matter-of-factly. Eleanor laughed, embarrassed and delighted. Thomas, but Elijah just smiled. Would you like that if we did? The boy considered this seriously. Yes, I would like that very much. Can I still play my drum? Every night by the fire if you want. Then yes, you should get married. Eleanor looked between them, these two males who had become the center of her world. Should I not have a say in this? Elijah took her hand. You have all the say, Eleanor. But if you are asking what I want, the answer is yes. I want to marry you. I want to be a father to Thomas. I want to build a life with both of you. She had thought she would need more time, that the scars from her first marriage would make her hesitate. But looking at Elijah, feeling the rightness of his hand in hers, she knew there was only one answer. Yes, she said. Yes, I will marry you. Thomas whooped and ran to them, and Elijah scooped him up with one arm while keeping the other around Eleanor. They stayed like that for a long moment, the three of them bound together in the shade of the mesquite trees, while the desert wind whispered around them. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in the small church at Fort Stockton, with most of the town in attendance. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself, and Elijah wore clean clothes that made his mountain man appearance only slightly more civilized. Thomas stood beside them as they exchanged vows, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the boy cheered as loud as anyone. Mr. Pemberton had given Eleanor the day off and provided a small celebration in the store with cake and punch for the guests. It was modest compared to the society weddings Eleanor had heard about, but it felt more genuine, more real. These were people who had watched their courtship, who had seen Elijah prove himself through steady work and consistent kindness. That night, they moved their few belongings into a small house that Elijah had rented on the edge of town. It had 2 rooms, a luxury after the single room at the boarding house, and Thomas was thrilled to have his own space. They set up his drum beside his bed, and he played it before sleep, the rhythm carrying through the thin walls to where Eleanor and Elijah lay in their own room. Are you happy? Elijah asked, pulling her close. More than I ever thought possible, she said truthfully. He kissed her temple. I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you stay that way. They made love for the first time that night, and Eleanor discovered that intimacy did not have to be something endured, but could be a source of joy and connection. Elijah was patient and attentive, attuned to her responses, and she felt cherished in a way that brought tears to her eyes. I love you, she whispered against his chest afterward. I love you too, both of you my family. The word settled around her like a warm blanket. Family. She had thought she lost that when her parents died, had thought her marriage had been a pale substitute. But this was real. This was what family was supposed to be. The next months were the happiest of Eleanor's life. She continued working at the general store, but now she came home to a husband who cooked dinner and helped Thomas with his lessons. Elijah took on carpentry work around town, and his skill and reliability made him sought after. They began saving money, planning for a future that included their own piece of land. Thomas thrived under Elijah's guidance. The boy learned to ride properly, to help with household tasks, to read the land the way Elijah did. And every night, without fail, he played his drum by the fire. Sometimes Elijah would join in, clapping or humming, and Eleanor would sit and watch them, her heart full to bursting. There were difficult moments, too. Eleanor had nightmares sometimes about her first husband, would wake gasping and afraid. But Elijah would hold her and remind her that she was safe now, that no one would hurt her again, and gradually, the nightmares came less frequently. One evening, after Thomas had gone to bed, Eleanor sat with Elijah on the small porch of their house. The stars were brilliant overhead, undimmed by any competing light. I have been thinking, Elijah said, about the future. What about it? I want to build us a real home. Not here in town, but out in the land. Somewhere we can have space, maybe run some cattle, grow our own food, be more self-sufficient. Eleanor considered this. You miss the wilderness. I miss the freedom of it, but I would not want to go back to being alone. I am thinking of something in between. A ranch, maybe, in the foothills, close enough to town for supplies and company, but far enough to have our own space. That sounds wonderful. But it would take money we do not have yet. Not as much as you might think. I know a place about 20 miles north of here. It has water and good grazing. The man who owns it is getting old and wants to sell. He would take payments if we could put something down. Eleanor felt excitement stirring. How much would we need? $200 to start. I have about 80 saved. If we keep working and saving, we could have enough by next spring. Then let us do it. Let us build our home. They talked late into the night, making plans and dreaming aloud. Eleanor imagined a house with real rooms, maybe a garden where she could grow vegetables, space for Thomas to run and play. Elijah described the land he was thinking of, painting pictures with his words of rolling hills and stands of oak trees, a creek that ran year-round. Over the following months, they saved every spare penny. Eleanor took on extra work mending clothes for other boarders at the house where they used to live. Elijah worked longer hours, taking jobs others did not want, and slowly, steadily, their savings grew. Thomas turned 9 that winter, and they celebrated with a small party. Elijah had carved him a new set of drumsticks, better balanced than the ones the boy had been using, and Thomas was ecstatic. That night, his drumming was particularly enthusiastic, and their neighbors probably cursed them, but Eleanor did not care. Hearing her son make joyful noise was worth any amount of complaints. In February of 1873, they finally had enough money. Elijah took 2 days off work, and they rode out to meet with the rancher who owned the property. Mr. Jenkins was indeed old. His hands gnarled with arthritis, and he seemed pleased to be selling to a young family. "It is good land," he said, sweeping his arm across the vista. "Treated me well for 40 years. I hope it does the same for you." Eleanor looked at the rolling hills covered in winter-brown grass, at the dark line of trees that marked the creek, at the mountains rising in the distance. It was beautiful and harsh and full of possibility. "We will take care of it," Elijah promised. They signed the papers, made the down payment, and rode home as landowners. Thomas could not stop talking about all the things they would do, all the animals they would have, all the adventures waiting for them. Spring brought the hard work of building. Elijah spent every spare moment on the land, and on weekends Eleanor and Thomas would come out to help. They cleared a spot for the house, gathered stones for a foundation, cut timber from their own trees. It was backbreaking labor, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. Eleanor continued working at the store through the summer, but Mr. Pemberton understood that her days there were numbered. He was sorry to lose her, but happy for her future. By fall, the house was habitable. It was rough still, with more work to be done, but it had walls and a roof and a fireplace. They moved their belongings out in a borrowed wagon, and Eleanor stood in the main room of their new home feeling like she was standing in a dream. "What do you think?" Elijah asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "I think it is perfect." Thomas ran in from exploring the creek. "Can we have chickens? And a cow? And a horse just for me?" "Eventually," Elijah said, with a laugh. "We will start small and build up. But yes, those are all things we can work toward." That night they had their first meal in the new house, simple beans and cornbread cooked over the fireplace, and after, Thomas played his drum while the firelight danced on the walls, and Eleanor sat beside her husband and felt more at peace than she ever had in her life. The years that followed were full of work and growth. They built up the ranch slowly, adding chickens first, then a milk cow, then a few head of cattle. Elijah proved to be a natural rancher, and Eleanor discovered she had a gift for managing their finances and planning for the future. Thomas grew tall and strong, learning the skills he would need to eventually take over the land. And every night, no matter how tired he was, Thomas played his drum by the fire. It became the soundtrack of their lives, that steady rhythm marking the passage of days and seasons. Sometimes neighbors would visit, and they would sit around the fire listening to the boy play, and someone would usually have a harmonica or a fiddle to join in. In the spring of 1875, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She was nervous at first, remembering the difficulty of carrying Thomas and the darkness of her first marriage. But Elijah's joy was infectious, and his constant care and attention soothed her fears. "It will be different this time," he promised. "You are not alone, and I will make sure you have everything you need." He was true to his word. As her belly grew, he took on more of the physical work around the ranch, insisting she rest when she needed to. Thomas, now 11, stepped up to help more as well, proud to be the older brother even before the baby arrived. The baby came in late November, a daughter they named Clara. She had Eleanor's dark hair and Elijah's brown eyes, and from the moment she was born, she was loved completely by her entire family. Thomas was fascinated by his little sister, and he would play his drum softly to help her sleep, the rhythm seeming to soothe her. Eleanor recovered well from the birth, and as winter settled in, they drew together as a family in their snug house. The work of the ranch continued, but at a slower pace, and there was time for simple pleasures. Elijah would carve small toys for Clara, and Thomas would play his drum, and Eleanor would sit by the fire nursing the baby and feeling blessed beyond measure. "I never imagined this," she said one evening to Elijah. "When I came to Fort Stockton, I was just trying to survive. I never thought I would find this kind of happiness." "Neither did I," he admitted. "I thought I would spend my life alone in the mountains. But this is so much better. You are so much better than anything I could have imagined for myself." They kissed, Clara sleeping peacefully between them, Thomas's drum providing a gentle rhythm in the background. It was an ordinary moment, and it was perfect. The years continued to unfold, bringing their share of challenges and triumphs. There were droughts that tested their resources and winters that pushed them to their limits. But they faced everything together, their partnership deepening with each season that passed. Thomas grew into a young man, tall and capable, with Elijah's strength and Eleanor's intelligence. He never lost his love for the drum, though as he got older, his playing became more sophisticated. He learned songs from travelers, incorporated different rhythms, and sometimes even carved his own drums to sell at market. Clara grew into a bright, curious child who followed her father and brother around the ranch asking endless questions. Elijah doted on her shamelessly, and Eleanor had to work to make sure the girl did not become too spoiled. But there was such joy in watching her husband with their daughter, seeing the gentleness in his massive hands as he taught her to ride or showed her how to identify bird calls. In 1878, Eleanor became pregnant again. This time she was less nervous, trusting in her body and in Elijah's care. Their second son was born in the spring of 1879, and they named him James. He was a quieter baby than Clara had been, content to watch the world with solemn eyes. The ranch prospered as their family grew. They added more cattle, improved the house, built a proper barn. Elijah's reputation as a fair dealer spread, and they developed relationships with other ranchers in the area. Eleanor started a small garden that expanded year by year until she was selling vegetables in Fort Stockton. Thomas turned 18 in 1881, and Eleanor marveled at how quickly time had passed. Her little boy was now a man, with plans and dreams of his own. But he showed no desire to leave the ranch, seeming content to work alongside Elijah and build the family legacy. "I am thinking of asking Sarah Henderson to the dance next month," Thomas said one evening, surprising Eleanor. Sarah was the daughter of the woman who had been Eleanor's first customer all those years ago at the general store. She was a sweet girl, and Eleanor approved. "I think that is a fine idea," she said. "Does she know you are interested?" Thomas blushed. "I am not sure. I am not as confident with women as I am with horses," Elijah laughed. "Son, no man is confident with women. We just pretend until they take pity on us." "That is not true," Eleanor protested, but she was smiling. "Just be yourself, Thomas. You are a good man, and any girl would be lucky to have you." Thomas did ask Sarah to the dance, and she accepted. Over the following months, they began courting, and Eleanor watched with bittersweet pride as her son fell in love. It reminded her of her own courtship with Elijah, though Thomas's was far more innocent and uncomplicated. One evening after the younger children were in bed, Eleanor and Elijah sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "We have built something good here," Elijah said. "We have. I never imagined my life could be like this." "Do you ever think about how we met? About the drum?" Eleanor smiled. "All the time. That drum changed everything. It gave Thomas something to hold on to when he was lost. It brought you into our lives, and now it is part of our family story. He still plays it every night." "I know. I love that he does. It is like a heartbeat for this family." Elijah pulled her close. "I love you, Eleanor, more with every year that passes. I love you too. You saved me, you know. Saved both of us. We saved each other. That is what love does." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged, and from inside the house they could hear the familiar rhythm of Thomas's drum, steady and sure as always. It was the sound of home, of family, of a life built on love and trust and hard work. Clara was 10 now, and James was 3, and they were talking about the possibility of another child. Eleanor was 41, and she knew the risks increased with age, but she also felt healthy and strong. Life on the ranch agreed with her in ways that city life never had. "Whatever you want," Elijah said when she brought it up. "I am happy either way. We have been blessed with the children we have, and if more come, that is a blessing too." As it turned out, Eleanor did become pregnant again in the fall of 1881. This time she was more cautious, mindful of her age, but the pregnancy progressed smoothly. Their third son was born in the summer of 1882, and they named him Ethan. He was a healthy, robust baby with a loud cry and strong will. Thomas married Sarah Henderson in the spring of 1883, and they built a small house on the far side of the ranch property. It gave them privacy while keeping the family close, and Eleanor was grateful not to lose her son to distance. Sarah fit into the family easily, and she and Eleanor developed a warm relationship. The ranch continued to grow and prosper through the 1880s. They weathered economic downturns and harsh weather, rustlers and disease, but each challenge only seemed to make them stronger. Elijah's hair began to gray at the temples, and Eleanor noticed lines appearing on her own face, but she wore them proudly. They were marks of a life well lived, of years spent in love and purpose. In 1885, Thomas and Sarah had their first child, a daughter they named Emma. Eleanor became a grandmother at 45, and she found she loved the role. Little Emma was a delight, and Elijah was just as smitten with his granddaughter as he had been with his own children. Clara, now 13, was becoming a young woman. She had her father's adventurous spirit and her mother's practical mind, and Eleanor suspected she would never be content with the traditional path expected of women. Elijah encouraged this, teaching her everything he would have taught a son, and Eleanor supported it, even though it sometimes drew criticism from more conventional neighbors. James was 6 now, and already showing signs of having his father's build. He was quieter than his siblings, thoughtful and observant, and he spent hours watching Elijah work, soaking up every lesson. Ethan at 3 was the family clown, always finding ways to make people laugh. And still, every night, Thomas played his drum by the fire. Even after marriage, even with his own household, he would come to the main house in the evenings and play, the rhythm as much a part of the family routine as breathing. Sometimes Emma would fall asleep to the sound, carried in Sarah's arms, and Eleanor would remember Thomas at that age, so solemn and sad, and marvel at how far they had all come. One evening in the summer of 1886, the whole family gathered for dinner. It was Thomas's birthday, and Sarah had made a special cake. As they sat around the table, Eleanor looked at the faces of the people she loved most in the world and felt her throat tighten with emotion. "I want to say something," she said, and everyone quieted. 14 years ago, a mountain man walked into Fort Stockton with nothing but his skills and his kindness. He gave a drum to a sad little boy and changed all of our lives. Elijah, you are the best thing that ever happened to us, and I am grateful every single day that you chose us. Elijah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I am the one who should be grateful. You took a chance on a rough man from the mountains. You gave me a family, a purpose, a home. Everything good in my life comes from you. Thomas raised his glass, to the drum that brought us together, and to the love that keeps us together. They all drank, even little Ethan with his cup of milk, and then Thomas brought out his drum. He played a rhythm he had been working on, complex and beautiful, and Clara sang a melody over it while Sarah clapped along. The music filled the house and spilled out into the night, carrying across the ranch that they had built together. Later, after the guests had left and the children were in bed, Eleanor and Elijah walked out to the creek that ran through their property. The moon was full, turning the water to silver, and the air was sweet with the scent of summer grass. "Do you remember that day we rode out here for the first time?" Elijah asked. "When we first saw this land. I remember. I thought it was beautiful but impossible. I could not imagine how we would ever make it work, but we did, together." Eleanor leaned against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Together. That is the key to everything, is it not? We faced it all together, and we always will. For however many years we have left, we will face them together. They stood there for a long time, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something lasting. The sound of the creek bubbling over stones mixed with the distant rhythm of drums from the house where Thomas was still playing, and Eleanor thought she had never heard a more perfect symphony. The years continued their steady march. Thomas and Sarah had 2 more children, and Clara eventually married a young rancher from a neighboring spread who could match her spirit and ambition. James grew into a serious young man with a gift for working with horses, and Ethan proved to have inherited his father's skill with wood and his grandfather's artistic sense. Eleanor's hair turned silver, and Elijah's beard went white, but they remained vigorous and active well into their 50s. The ranch was now a significant operation, employing several hands and running hundreds of head of cattle. Thomas had taken over most of the day-to-day management, freeing Elijah to focus on the things he loved most, working with wood, teaching his grandchildren, spending quiet evenings with Eleanor. In 1895, on the anniversary of their wedding, Eleanor and Elijah stood in front of the house they had built together so many years before. It had been expanded and improved over the decades, but the heart of it remained the same. The fireplace where Thomas had first played his drum still dominated the main room, though it was now surrounded by comfortable furniture and rugs and all the accumulated treasures of a long life. 22 years, Eleanor said. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like forever. Both, Elijah agreed. It is both, is it not? Time is strange that way. Thomas came out of the house carrying his drum, still the same one Elijah had given him all those years ago. It was worn now, the rawhide replaced several times, the carved wood polished smooth by decades of handling. But it was still recognizably the same instrument, still capable of producing that same deep, resonant sound. I thought I would play for you, Thomas said, in honor of your anniversary. They sat on the porch as the sun set, and Thomas played. His children and grandchildren gathered to listen, 3 generations brought together by love and music, and the choices made so long ago in Fort Stockton. The rhythm was complex now, incorporating everything Thomas had learned over the years, but at its heart it was still the same simple beat of a boy making sense of his world through sound. When he finished, there was a moment of perfect silence, and then everyone applauded. Thomas stood and embraced his mother and stepfather, and Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. Thank you, she whispered, for everything, for being the man you have become, for keeping the music alive. It is my heart, Thomas said simply. That drum is my heart, and all of you are in it. The party continued into the night with food and music and laughter. Eleanor danced with Elijah the way they used to when they were young, though now they moved more slowly, more carefully. But the feeling was the same, that sense of perfect rightness, of being exactly where they were meant to be. As the guests began to leave and the younger children were carried off to bed, Eleanor and Elijah found themselves alone on the porch again. The stars were brilliant overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding, the birth of their children, every important moment of their shared life. I would do it all again, Eleanor said. Every bit of it, exactly the same. Even the hard parts, even those, because they brought us here. To this moment, this life, this family. Elijah kissed her forehead. You are my miracle, Eleanor, the mountain man's miracle, and you are mine. They sat in the darkness, holding hands, listening to the night sounds of their ranch. Somewhere in the house, one of the grandchildren cried out in sleep and was quickly soothed. From the barn came the restless movement of horses, and underneath it all, still present in Eleanor's memory, was the steady beat of the drum, the rhythm that had brought them together and sustained them through everything that followed. In the years that came after, they slowed down gradually, as all people do. Elijah's hands grew stiff with arthritis, though he still carved when he could. Eleanor's eyesight dimmed, though she could still manage the household accounts and tend her garden. They gave more and more responsibility to Thomas and the younger generation, content to step back and let others take the lead. But they remained the heart of the family, the foundation upon which everything else was built. Their love story was told and retold to the grandchildren, growing with each telling, becoming the mythology that bound the family together. The drum that started it all was treated as a precious heirloom, carefully maintained and played on special occasions. Thomas never stopped his nightly ritual when he was home, though now he had to teach his own children to do the same. The tradition passed down, generation to generation, a living connection to the moment when a mountain man's kindness changed the course of multiple lives. Eleanor and Elijah celebrated their 30th anniversary in 1903. They were both in their 60s now, gray and weathered, but still strong in spirit. The party was enormous, with family and friends coming from all over Texas to honor the couple who had built such a remarkable legacy. As Eleanor looked around at the crowd of people, at the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who filled her home, she thought back to that frightened woman who had arrived in Fort Stockton with nothing but a traumatized child and desperate hope. She barely recognized herself in that person now. "What are you thinking?" Elijah asked, coming up beside her. "About how far we have come, about all the lives that have been changed because you walked into a general store and decided to give a drum to a sad little boy. Best decision I ever made. Well, second best. Asking you to marry me was the best." She laughed. "I think I made it fairly easy for you, maybe, but I would have kept trying until you said yes. Some things are worth fighting for." They kissed, not caring who might see, and the crowd around them cheered. Thomas raised his drum high in the air, and then he began to play, the familiar rhythm filling the evening air. Others joined in, clapping and singing, and the celebration continued late into the night. When everyone had finally gone and the house was quiet again, Eleanor and Elijah made their way to their bedroom. They moved more slowly now with the aches and pains of age, but they moved together as they had for 3 decades. "I am tired," Eleanor admitted, settling into bed. "Me too, but it is a good tired. The best kind." Elijah wrapped his arms around her, and she nestled against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. It was slower now than it had been when they were young, but it was still strong, still steady, like the beat of the drum, like the rhythm of their life together. "I love you," she said, "more than I can ever say. I love you too. Always have, always will." They fell asleep like that, tangled together, and if they dreamed, it was of mountains and drums and all the years yet to come. Elijah passed away in the spring of 1908, on a warm afternoon while working in the garden he had maintained for Eleanor. He went quickly, without pain, and Thomas found him lying among the vegetables with a peaceful expression on his face. He was 68 years old and had lived every day of his life with purpose and love. Eleanor was devastated, but not broken. She had known this day would come eventually, had steeled herself for it as best she could. At the funeral, Thomas played the drum, and the sound carried across the ranch, a farewell to the man who had given it to him so many years before. "He was the best man I ever knew," Thomas said during the eulogy. "He taught me what it meant to be a father, a husband, a good person. Everything I am, I owe to him." Eleanor stood beside her son, dry-eyed but hollow. She had lost her partner, her love, her other half. But she still had the family they had built together, the legacy of their love, and she still had the memories of every precious moment they had shared. In the months after Elijah's death, Eleanor withdrew somewhat, struggling to find her footing in a world without him. But the family rallied around her, refusing to let her slip into grief's darkness. Clara moved back into the main house to keep her mother company. James and Ethan visited daily. Thomas came every evening to play the drum by the fire, maintaining the tradition even though its creator was gone. Slowly, Eleanor began to heal. She would never stop missing Elijah, but she learned to carry the grief alongside the joy, to hold both at once. She threw herself into helping with the grandchildren, passing on the stories and lessons that Elijah would have wanted them to know. She lived another 8 years, strong and sharp almost to the end. In the summer of 1916, at the age of 76, she gathered her children around her bed and told them she was ready. "I have had a good life," she said, "better than I ever dreamed possible." And it all started with a drum and a man brave enough to show kindness to strangers. "Do not talk like that," Clara said, tears streaming down her face. "You are going to be fine." But Eleanor shook her head. "I am tired, sweetheart, and I am ready to be with your father again. But I need you all to promise me something." "Anything," Thomas said. "Keep playing the drum, keep telling the stories, make sure the next generations know where they come from, know the love that built this family. Promise me." They promised, all of them, and Eleanor smiled. That night she slipped away peacefully in her sleep, and those who were there swore they heard the faint sound of drumming as she went. They buried her beside Elijah on a hill overlooking the ranch, under an oak tree they had planted together when they first bought the land. Thomas played the drum at her funeral too, and this time he could not hold back his tears. He had lost his mother and his father, the two people who had given him everything, but he kept his promise. Every night he played the drum by his fire, and he taught his children and grandchildren to do the same. The tradition continued through the generations, an unbroken line reaching back to that moment in 1872 when a mountain man carved a drum and gave it to a sad little boy. The ranch prospered and grew, eventually becoming one of the largest in that part of Texas. The family expanded and spread, but they always maintained connections, always came together for holidays and celebrations. And at the center of every gathering was the drum, worn and precious, a physical reminder of the love that had started it all. The story of Eleanor and Elijah became family legend, told and retold until it took on mythic proportions, but at its heart it remained a simple truth. Two damaged people had found each other in the hardness of the West and built something beautiful. They had loved each other fiercely and raised their children well. They had worked hard and laughed often and created a legacy that would outlast them by generations. And every night, somewhere, one of their descendants played a drum by the fire, keeping the rhythm alive, honoring the memory of a mountain man and the woman who loved him and the boy whose music brought them all together. The beat went on, steady and sure, a heartbeat that would never stop as long as there was someone to remember, someone to play, someone to pass the story along. In the end, that was all that mattered. Not the ranch or the money or the land, but the love that had created it all and the music that kept it alive. The drum beat on, generation after generation, a promise kept, a legacy honored, a love story that would never end.